Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Let me kick off then by introducing Professor Edward Fieldhouse from the British Election Study. All three of you are going to have a little bit of an expansive chat about your areas of expertise, and then we'll open the floor up to questions, and as many as you like. We're sort of free-wielding till about 11, so there you go.
Okay, that's better. Right, so good morning. I'm Ed Fieldhouse. I'm one of the directors of the British Election Study. So this morning we're going to be talking about some of the implications of our research on the BES for the forthcoming general election. But before we do that, I want to give you a little bit of background to this research, an overview of our ideas about how elections work and what the implications are for the forthcoming election. So the research that I'll be talking about this morning is being published in the book that Anand kindly mentioned at the outset on electoral shocks, the volatile voter in a turbulent world. And as the title suggests, it really explores how voters have become more changeable, more likely to switch between elections. And we're trying to understand why that is, and why, as a result, do political events, unexpected happenings, key decisions tend to have a bigger effect now than what they did in the past. Now, there's been similar or equivalent books after most general elections since the British Election Study began in 1964, and each of them have made an important contribution. For example, on the importance of social position and class voting, through to the rise of issue voting, and more recently on performance politics and how governments are judged on how they manage the economy. All of these provide really important insights, and we don't contradict any of these, but they don't explain why voters or why elections have become more unpredictable than they have in the past. And that's exactly what we're trying to explore in this book. And we think the answer to that lies in electoral shocks. As I said, those events, those decisions, those unexpected changes that happen in everyday in politics. Because of the increasing voter volatility, the increasing tendency of voters to switch between elections, we argue that these shocks have a greater impact than they have previously. Now, I can show you how voters have become more switchable, more changeable, by illustrating a comparison between 1964 and 2017. Now, these charts use panel data, so they compare the same voters at one election and how they voted in the following election. And so, for example, the one on the right uses our recent panel, which tracks the same 30,000 voters over 17 different instances, over 17 different time points since 2014. The colours just represent the colours of the parties. The left hand of the chart represents what people voted for in 2015, and the right-hand part, what they voted for in 2017. So, but by looking at the size of the blocks moving across, and the amount to which they switch between colours, helps you see the amount of changeability. And I'm sorry this display isn't working here. I think that's... Okay, yeah. That's not a mistake, sorry. So hopefully those sitting in the middle can see one of the other displays. But what you really see from this slide is quite clear, which is, on the left-hand slide, voters between 1964 and 1966 pretty much didn't move. There's just big blocks. They either voted Conservative and they voted Labour, and they did so at both elections. There isn't much by way of change. But if you look at the right-hand chart, you can see an enormous amount of change. Voters are switching in quite large numbers. In fact, there's about a third of all voters switched in these two elections. So you get a bit of a bowl of spaghetti rather than these big monolithic blocks. We can chart how that tendency has changed over time just by plotting what we call individual level volatility. And this is very simple. This is just the percentage of people who voted for a different party at the second election compared to the first, so people who changed their vote. And as you can see in this chart, there's been a steady upward shift in volatility since the British election studies began in the 1960s. And it reached a peak in 2015 when volatility was over 40%, more than 4 out of 10 voters switched parties. It dropped back a little bit, as Allegra said in the ITV piece. It dropped back a little bit in 2017, but the last 3 elections have been the most volatile on record. So the question really that we want to address is, why is this happening? Now, we put forward 2 major explanations. Trying to model these changes, we basically find 2 key things that matter. One is the decline of party identification. That is, voters have become less attached to the political parties than they were in the past. So people used to say they identify with or they feel close to a particular political party. Not just how they vote, but how they actually feel. They felt close to a political party. That sense of attachment has steadily declined over time, and John will be talking more about this in the next talk. The second explanation is the rise of smaller parties. So, for various reasons, party support has become more fragmented, and smaller parties have increasingly come to the fore. Now, those smaller parties tend to be less good at hanging on to their votes from one election to the next. So the better small parties do, the more volatile electorate tends to be. So that's the second major explanation. But together, these things only explain about half the upward drift in volatility. So to understand the rest of that change, we have to look at electoral shocks. And it's important to note here that electoral shocks both contribute to volatility, but they also determine the way in which volatile voters tend to move, and therefore they have an impact on how shocks work. So shocks will have a greater impact because voters are more likely to shift. No, that's the wrong way. So just to explain what I mean by electoral shocks, I've already said how they are, how we refer to events and decisions and unexpected changes. But we have 3 basic criteria by which we define shocks. Firstly, that they represent an abrupt change to the status quo. And that usually is something coming from the outside of everyday politics. It's not purely internal to the party political system. It's what social scientists call something which is exogenous, or at least partly exogenous. It's coming from the outside. Secondly, they have to be very salient, very difficult to ignore, very difficult for voters to ignore, but also very difficult for politicians to ignore. And because they're salient and big, if you like, they cut through even to people who are less interested in politics. The third criteria is that they have to be relevant to party politics. So you can imagine various big events may happen, but if they're not party political in nature, then they're not going to have a big impact on elections. So they have to be relevant to party politics. Now, we also show in the book how shocks work, and they work in 3 main ways. Shocks can change the salience of issues. That is, they bring some issues to the fore and they make other issues less important. And in terms of what drives voters to vote the way they do. So you'll see various examples of this, but obviously you've seen recently how the Brexit shock has brought to the fore issues around Europe and immigration. They also change perceptions of the competence of political actors, political parties. So, for example, a shock may affect how voters see a particular party in terms of their ability to manage a particular area of politics. So, for example, the global economic crisis had an impact on Labour's perceived competence for managing the economy. Now, the third mechanism we identify is that shocks change the social or political image of parties. That is, they can change how people see the parties in terms of what they stand for and who they stand for. So they make people view the parties in a different way, and this is important. So if you look at the Scottish independence referendum, for example, Labour stopped being seen so much as a party of the left as being a party of the union. So in our book, we cover 5 recent electoral shocks, which are listed here. So there's the immigration shock following the EU accession in the early 2000s, the global financial crisis and subsequent austerity, the 2010 coalition government, the Scottish independence referendum, and then of course, the biggest shock of all, the EU referendum and the subsequent vote for Brexit. So what are the implications of this research for 2019? Obviously, we can't predict future shocks, but we can try to understand the impact of the shocks that have happened on 2019 voters. Obviously, Brexit being the most important. Now, there are three important implications for 2019. Firstly, that volatility is likely to remain high because volatility increases from generation to generation. So the younger voters entering the electorate tend to be more likely to shift than their parents. They have less party attachments than their parents. So this upward change in volatility is likely to continue. Now, obviously, it's going to vary from election to election, including in 2019. So it could be offset in 2019 because of the fact that Labour and Conservatives got a large share of the vote in 2017. As I said, smaller parties tend to lose more of their votes. So the fact that the larger parties did well could put a cap on volatility. Secondly, the Brexit shock led to new dividing lines in politics, and these could become crystallized, meaning that certain types of people could be more likely to stay with the choices they made in 2017. So, for example, young people voting Labour, Brexit supporters voting Conservative, and so forth. So these new dividing lines along the lines of education, age, values, and so forth may cause voters to remain more stable. And then thirdly, as Chris will be talking about, I think, if Brexit identities, if people have become identified as Leavers or Remainers, they have a new political identity to replace their party identity. And if this remains aligned with party choice, then the rise of Brexit identities could lead to greater stability. So these are all things that could offset the rise in volatility. I say could because I think, as John will be showing, that's the evidence is suggesting that may not happen. The second major implication for 2019 is that the Brexit shock will continue to have a large impact because of the more volatile electorate. That, as I said, voters are not anchored. They're not strongly attached to their political parties, and therefore their choice is likely to be affected by what parties do on Brexit. And it's important to say, I probably should have said this in the previous slide, but it's important to say in this context that shocks provide our political opportunities, so the mechanisms of shocks work through how parties respond to them. So there's nothing automatic about how shocks affect the popularity of different parties. It depends on how the parties respond to them. So they provide opportunity for parties. And clearly, in the case of Brexit, the Conservatives went for a Leave vote. They appealed to Leave voters, and that's still playing out in 2019. Now, and the third implication of our research for 2019 is that the campaign does matter. We saw that in the last election. And it was visible mainly because a lot of the shifting during the campaign all went in the same direction. So it went towards Labour. Now, I think campaigns generally have an impact, but quite often they result in shifts going in countervailing directions. So they basically cancel each other out. Whereas in 2017, you saw a drift in one direction towards Labour. So the campaign does matter. But of course, it depends on how well the parties perform in the campaign. Here's another of those what we call Sankey plots. This is just to give you an idea of what is actually happening in practice, and John will be saying more about this. But this is looking at vote switching since 2017. So i.e. how people voted in 2017 and what they said they would vote in the most recent wave of the election study. And that was data collected between the 1st and the 11th of November. And that's the 30,000 plus voters that Jane referred to. So clearly, there's a lot of switching, essentially. It's comparable to what we saw in 2017. It's quite comparable to what we saw in 2015. So unless there's a strong drift back to the major parties, which there could be if people decide that those parties offer the best option under the current electoral system, volatility could drop, but at the moment it's looking like it was in the previous election, i.e. high. And finally, to illustrate the impact of shocks in 2019, I wanted to show you this slide, which is how the parties break down by their Brexit preference. So this is Brexit preferences, leave or remain, by vote intention in the recent wave of the British election study. So the height of the bar represents the popularity of the party at that point in time, and the colours within the bar represent how many of them are voting gold for remain and blue for leave. And what you see is that the parties are very polarised in terms of their Brexit support. They're more sorted than they actually were at the previous election. They're more sorted than they were in 2017. I think it's 88% of Labour voters or Labour intended voters in the recent study, the recent survey, said they would vote Remain in another referendum, and 85% of Conservatives would vote Leave. So that's compared to 68% of Labour voters 68% of Labour voters were Remain in 2017, and 72% of Conservative voters were Leave in 2017. So those figures have gone up. There's more polarisation. Okay, so I hope that gave you a little bit of understanding of the arguments in the book and how that might be important for the forthcoming election. I'm going to pass over now to John, who's going to talk a little more detail about voter volatility.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Yeah, so I'm going to be just filling out a few more of the details about what we've seen with voter volatility up until now, and then putting 2019 into that context. So the first thing to bear in mind is this is the percentage of voters who were identifiers with each of the major parties all the way back to the 1960s through to 2017. And I could tell you the story about how Labour goes up and down from election to election and the Conservatives gain more identifiers or fewer. But really the big story here is this big black area at the top, which is the percentage of non-identifiers or people with only a weak identity. And that has just been increasing from a very small minority of voters to really around half of them now have no identity with a party at all. And this has played out a lot in recent elections because this means there's a lot of voters who don't have that strong automatic attachment that they know how they will vote every time. Instead, they potentially will switch. And we're going to show this chart a lot today. They are switching at ever higher rates. And this is a direct result of this group of voters who don't have any identity with a particular party. So moving now to how things have been changing since 2017 up until the pre-election wave, this was just before the campaign started, we're seeing a lot of switching here. We're seeing the Conservative vote splintering towards Lib Dems on the Remain side, the Brexit Party at quite a high rate, and also a lot of people saying they just don't know who they're going to vote for yet. And that's the same for Labour as well. A lot of their voters have switched to the Lib Dems. A lot of them say they don't know who they'll vote for. A surprising number have even switched to the Conservatives. So there's a lot of volatility here. Now, how does this factor into this chart? Well, I've given you two figures here, and that depends on whether we include people who say they don't know who they're going to vote for or not. So the figure is either a bit higher than 2017 or a little bit lower. Now, the way to think through that is about 14% of our respondents at the moment say they don't know who they're going to vote for. Now, if we look at 2017, among the don't knows, around half of them ended up switching back to their 2015 party. And this is a key thing to look out for in the 2019 election. Is this going to happen again, that there will be a general switching back among people who are undecided towards their previous party? If that did happen, then we would expect around 30% of voters to switch between 2017 and 2019. And that's pretty comparable to what we saw in 2015 and 2017 switching. Maybe a little bit lower, but along the same order of magnitude. However, before we think this is just a repeat of 2017, there's some ways in which this election is actually very different. So this chart here shows the percentage of voters who supported Labour or Conservative at the previous election. What percentage of them switched to the other major party? Now, if we look at 2017, it was the highest ever figure on record for switching between Labour and Conservative directly. Brexit came along, and as we said, it was a very large electoral shock and made people who would never have considered voting for the other major party switch directly to them because they suddenly found themselves on the opposite side of the referendum debate. That's not happening this time. This time, with the red triangle there, it's really quite low. There's not many people switching directly between Labour and Conservatives. And that's mostly because the people who are going to do that have already switched. That's already happened in 2017. The switching we're seeing this time is happening a lot more within Brexit blocs than further switching between them. There is some of that, but 2017 saw so much switching on that basis that there wasn't that much left to go. Another historical comparison we need to bear in mind is how good are the major parties at holding on to their previous voters. So this chart here shows the percentage of voters for a party at a previous election. What percentage of their voters ended up leaving the party at the next election? So I'm showing it for Labour and Conservatives here. And what we've tended to see is that both of the major parties are pretty good at holding on to their previous voters. Generally, in the past, somewhere around 15, 20% of them will switch to another party at the next election. Now, by contrast, for Liberal Democrats and Greens and the other minor parties, they consistently lose half their voters at the next election. The only way they manage to keep their vote share up is by recruiting new voters to make up for the huge amount of churn you see beneath the surface. But this time, and this is on the same axis here, Labour, for instance, in the pre-election wave that was just a few weeks ago, more than half of their 2017 voters no longer intended to vote for them. That is historically unprecedented in any of the previous surveys we've seen, that a major party would lose that many of their previous voters. And you can sort of see this in two possible ways. On the one hand, Labour is doing historically badly on this. On the other hand, perhaps that means we should expect it to revert a bit more to the historical trend. If Labour merely improved to historically bad rather than unprecedentedly bad, they would regain a lot of voters. And the Conservatives, too, here are at the very upper end of defections away from them that we've seen in historic surveys. So either we're really seeing a change in the way that major parties hold on to their voters, or there's a lot of opportunity for the major parties to regain their voters during the campaign. And certainly from my perspective, this is a big thing I'm going to be watching out for going forwards in 2019. So we've also got some preliminary data from the first 2 weeks of the campaign wave. So this is just in the last 2 or 3 weeks of data. And we can look at how much switching has taken place since the pre-election wave. And there's quite a lot. This is only a 2-week gap between these two surveys. And you're seeing voters switching in quite large numbers. You have the Brexit Party collapsing in a major way towards the Conservatives. You have Liberal Democrat voters flowing towards Labour. And you also have people who said they were undecided switching back towards the major parties. So how much volatility is this? Well, it's 21% of voters in just a couple of weeks have changed their vote intention. That's very high. If we exclude the don't knows from that, it's 13%. And for comparison, that was the amount of volatility we saw between the entire elections of 1964 and 1966. We're now getting the same amount of volatility in 2 weeks that we had in 2 years in the 1960s. So this campaign, although it might look quite stable on the surface, has seen a lot of volatility beneath the surface. And that means that we can actually have a lot of opportunity for further change here in one direction or another. Even though there's only a few weeks left, there could be a lot of change happening even now. So to conclude, voter volatility has increased dramatically, and it looks like it's going to remain high unless something changes quite a lot in the last few weeks. Labour at the moment are currently set for a historically bad retention, but that also means that if they merely improve to very bad, there'll be a lot of change. So that's an important positive and negative for Labour, that they do have the opportunity to gain merely by improving their results among their own previous voters. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk more specifically about the effect of Brexit on voting between 2015 and 17, and then looking a little bit at how this might play out both in 2019 and thinking more broadly about the sort of long-term implications for the way British politics is structured. And we've been talking a lot about volatility, and this is what voting switching looked like between 2015 and 2017 for Leave and Remain voters. And you can see that it wasn't just sort of random switching, which is what it sort of looks like when you sort of pull everything together. There's just people going all over the place. It's much more directed. So for Leavers, it went towards the Conservatives, and then for Remainers, it went towards Labour. But this doesn't necessarily just mean that people were voting for specific policies, right? It might mean something more fundamental about the way people are seeing the world. And particularly, we draw on an idea from social psychology, from social identity theory, which shows that people can think about the world in sort of categorical terms. Who is us and who is them? And traditionally in politics, of course, the us and them is parties. You know, you are my party, and they are some other party. They're the out-group. But what we saw in the run-up to the referendum and in the aftermath is that Brexit was starting to become something that people started to categorize the world into. And what we saw when we used a battery of questions to measure this that was originally developed for measuring party identities was that just before the referendum, people were sort of identifying fairly equally between the two of them. But immediately after the referendum, people were much more strongly thinking of themselves as being Leave or Remain than they were in terms of thinking of themselves as a partisan. And we can also see that that gap has remained pretty stably. It wiggles a bit here and there depending on what happens. But the most recent data from a sort of month or so ago shows that the referendum identity is much, much stronger than party identity. And this obviously has huge potentials for how politics is going to play out, right? So we've talked already about how this has been driving switching between parties, but Ed mentioned earlier as well, it could also result in terms of stability. If people settle into their referendum sides and the referendum sides become aligned with partisan identities, then we might see some stability. So one thing we can look at is how do these different identities map onto the different parties, particularly the Conservatives and Labour, and how do they sort of cross-cut? So if we look at people that voted Conservative in 2017, we see that the largest block by far are people who feel more strongly Leave than they do Conservative. And if we sort of skip ahead to the Labour, you won't be surprised to hear that the largest block is people who feel more strongly Remain than Labour. But going back to the Conservatives, the other things to notice are that there's a very, very small number of people who feel more Conservative than Labour. It's only about sort of 25% in total. So the vast majority of people who voted Conservative at the last election feel much more strongly about the referendum than they do about the party. And so perhaps it's not unsurprising then, when you look at what happened around the European Parliament election, you see huge numbers of Conservative voters switching to the Brexit Party, and then they sort of hold up in the polls, and then Boris Johnson comes along, and then they all start flowing back around the other way. So the way that Brexit maps onto party identity and party competition is going to be very important for how these things are driving the political change. And then if we go back to Labour, the important things to note are first that actually the sort of partisan core of the Labour Party is much stronger than the Conservatives. So around 40% of Labour voters at the last election actually feel more strongly Labour than they did on the referendum. So for Labour, this is good news, because it means they have a sort of stronger partisan core that they can sort of fall back to. And we have seen less volatility amongst Labour voters and who they're being switching to in sort of the last couple of years. And the other thing to note is that both sides have sort of counter referendum identities to the way that you would think the sort of majority of people. So for the Conservatives, they have about 20% of their voters feel more strongly Remain than Conservative, and for Labour, there's about 20% of people who feel more strongly Leave than Labour. And these are obviously the people who might hold the key to what happens in this election, right? If Brexit is still the issue that is driving people's vote choice, these are the people we need to look out for and see what they're going to do. And so if we look at how they were going to vote about a month or so ago, if we first look at the sort of Leave-identifying Labour voters, we see first that actually most of them are going somewhere else other than Labour. So Labour is getting about 20%, but that means about 80% are either going to someone else or they're going, they don't currently know, as John was talking about. There's still quite a few people who are undecided. And the really important thing to note about this graph is that there's a sort of quite a large chunk who are going directly to the Conservative Party. And there's also a large chunk who were intending to vote the Brexit Party. And we've seen in the sort of polls that a lot of these voters have flowed towards the Conservatives as well. So the thing to note here is that there's a very large direct flow from Labour to the Conservatives. And keep that in mind as I show you what the Conservative Remainers look like, who have hardly any direct flow from the Conservatives to Labour. Instead, there's a much larger chunk of Conservatives staying loyal to the Conservatives, but also there's a huge chunk going towards the Liberal Democrats. So this is important for two reasons. First, that it suggests that Labour aren't going to benefit in terms of Conservative-Labour competitions from Conservative Remain voters, but that the Liberal Democrats might be benefiting from Conservative Remainers switching towards them. And so in terms of Conservative-Labour competitions, it's a very one-sided battle, right? The Conservatives are picking up Labour Leave voters, but Labour aren't getting any Conservative Remain, or not many Conservative Remain voters. So what does this mean for the sort of broader picture of British politics? Does this mean that we're shifting from political competition that has historically been primarily about economics, about redistribution, about taxation and that sort of thing, to something that looks perhaps a bit more like America, where it's all about cultural divides and issues to do with the sort of social dimension of politics? And this is something that we look at in our book. Basically what we find is that if you look at all the sort of political parties, so the choice set, including the Liberal Democrats and UKIP and the Greens and so on, we found that in 2015, the economic and cultural dimensions were actually pretty similar already. This is pre-referendum, remember. So, these two dimensions are sort of neck and neck when it comes to sort of overall vote choice. And then when we go to 2017, we see a small uptick for the sort of cultural dimension, but actually the thing to note is it's actually not that big a change. And this at first sort of throws people, but if you think back to 2015, we already had huge UKIP vote. The Greens did quite well, and Lib Dems obviously not doing very well, but there was still a lot of vote choice along these sort of cultural lines. What really changed in 2017 was how vote choice between Labour and the Conservatives was structured. So if we look at the sort of same thing, we can see that the economic dimension in 2015 was much more important for driving Conservative and Labour vote choice. But then when we go to 2017, we find that actually the cultural dimension is suddenly much, much more important. So how are these things going to change this time round? And so Ed and John have both given you some clues that actually we might be getting even more sorted along Brexit lines than we were previously. And if we go back to the sort of choice amongst all parties, we find that in 2019, the sort of preliminary pre-election data shows that the cultural dimension is becoming even more important. And then if we go to the Labour and Conservative vote choice, we find an enormous change once again. So at least in our sort of pre-election data, it looks like this sort of second dimension of politics is actually becoming perhaps the first dimension of British politics. But this sort of raises a bigger question. Does this mean that British politics is sort of realigned? Have we undergone a realignment? And perhaps, how would we know? I think is a sort of more fundamental question. How would we know if we had become realigned? What would alignment look like? And there is no sort of objective threshold we can point to that says, oh, well, this number of people voted this way and this number of people voted this way. If we got to 100% leave voting one way and 100% remain voting, we could probably agree that was alignment. But at some point between no alignment and that, there's probably some level we might think that counts as alignment. And one way we can do this is to think about how does the sort of alignment along Brexit lines compare to previous alignments, and particularly how does it compare to class voting in the 1960s. So if you ever studied British politics at university, you probably know this quote, which sort of features on thousands of undergraduate essays every year. Basically, I mean, it was an exaggeration even at the time, but if we think back to the sort of post-war period, British politics is primarily about class. So what does that look like when we measure it? And there's been long, fairly tedious academic debates about how you measure the extent of class voting. But one of the most common ways is something called the Thompson Index of class voting, which just measures the sort of ratio of people in one class, so working class, say, voting Labour, or people who aren't working class voting Labour, and comparing to both sides voting for other parties. And when we use that measure to measure class voting in the post-war era, it ends up being about 1.6. And we can use the same measure because we've got nice binary categories, leave and remain, and see how does this map onto how people are voting along Brexit lines. And if we look at 2017 for the Conservatives, we can see that, well, actually, it's pretty similar to the levels of class voting. So the level of alignment between leave and remain is pretty similar between the alignment between the working classes and Labour in the post-war era. And if we think that, that was an era in which everything was about class, then, maybe this is an era in which everything is about Brexit. But having said that, there's, of course, some slight complications. We could measure it slightly differently. We could measure it with Remain voters and Labour, and then it goes down a little bit because the Remain side is slightly more fragmented. But we could also see what it looks like this time, and we could look at the 2019 data, and it's gone up even higher. And so maybe we are, regardless of how you measure it, looking at a sort of levels of class voting. But the other thing to say is that class voting isn't the only comparison we could make, right? And there was another referendum that had major consequences for British politics, which was in Scotland. So what does Scotland look like if we use the same measures in terms of the yes and no sides and voting for the SNP? Well, that looks like that. And so compared to the Scottish referendum, actually Brexit, small fry when it comes to explaining British voting behaviour. But if we ignore the SNP, which is an incredibly strong alignment between referendum vote choice and vote choice in the election, it does look like Brexit is a very strong alignment between the way people voted in the referendum and the way people are voting in elections compared to sort of historical benchmarks. And so I'll leave you with a slightly cheeky paraphrasing of a quote. I'm not sure it's strictly true, but it wasn't really strictly true in the 60s either, but it's definitely something to think about. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. We'll open the floor up to questions now, so do put your hands up, and there is a microphone winging its way to you. But just in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for that, I mean, Labour have been obviously desperately trying for this not to be the Brexit election, to the point where I think they complained about Sky's branding of it. I mean, they've literally lost that battle. I mean, from what you're saying, this is essentially the Brexit election. Would we agree with that?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, or at least it's a Brexit election, because I think we might have said that the 2017 election was the Brexit election as well. But the same thing happened in 2017, where you saw both parties actually do their best not to mention the sort of B word. And I think partly that's because Labour know that their best hope is for it not to be about Brexit, actually, because they need to bring back people who don't agree with them on Brexit, but do agree with them on other issues. So if they can make it about another set of issues, then they stand to benefit. I think what the campaign in both in 2017 and this time probably shows that parties don't have sort of monopoly power on that sort of thing. They can try and set the agenda, but actually people might just care about other stuff anyway.
And it's interesting when you talk about, the traditional class-based economic campaigns, that actually if you move beyond that, it looks like, you can see that from the spending promises, £1 for every 28 from the Conservatives versus Labour, in the sense that the Conservatives have cottoned onto the fact that actually even if all the statistics and all the experts say you'll be a bit poorer if you vote for this, actually it's gone beyond economic attitude. Is that where we're at? Which is a shift, isn't it?
I mean, yes, it's as Chris said, it's not always in the Labour Party's in particular's interest to promote Brexit as the major issue, but there is a bit of an arms race in terms of spending commitments, which I think it's a slightly different issue, which is that the discipline in terms of costing manifestos, etc.
The competence element of what you talk
about.
Yeah.
But actually the cost of actually promising stuff is slightly undermined by the voter scepticism about the facts that are being produced, I think. So, and obviously the Conservatives don't wish to continue promoting austerity in this election. So it means that there's slightly less of a distinction between Labour and the Conservatives, even if Labour's spending commitments are a hell of a lot bigger. I mean, I think these numbers are so big in terms of the commitments that people can't really differentiate, the billions from the millions from the trillions kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, we've got a couple of hands up, so more than a couple. Who's got a microphone? Where have we? Well, do you want to just choose somebody? There you go, just choose it there and then hand it along. Just if you can keep sort of questions reasonably short. So we get as many.
Keith Best, I'm Secretary of the European Movement. I was with Rob Hayward last night, whom you will know, and he said a couple of things, amongst many others. One was that this is an election which he's found to be extremely local rather than national, and I wonder if you would agree with that and what the implications are of that. The second thing is about trying to ascertain people's intentions. Men are known to lie more than women to pollsters, statistically, but also Conservative men are far less likely to say they're switching to Lib Dem if that's really what they're going to do. They will still maintain the fiction that they actually are strong Conservatives. Again, would you agree with that conclusion?
So I'll start with the second one first, about essentially the shy Tory question. So overall, the evidence for shy Tories isn't actually as strong as people have made out. We tend to think that whenever there's a polling miss, it means people have been lying. But the overall evidence from various studies that have been done, including by us, is that, well, the Conservatives were underestimated in the polls, for instance, in 2015, and that was attributed to shy Tories. Actually, the problem was unrepresentative samples, that people weren't being sampled who were going to vote Conservative in the first place, rather than that they were lying about it. With the British election study face-to-face survey, which is a higher quality probability sample done immediately afterwards, in that there was no underrepresentation of the Conservatives, whereas in the polls and in the internet panel of the BES, the Conservatives were underrepresented. So I think the shy Tory thing is probably not entirely untrue, but I think we often attribute to shy Tories what's actually problems with the polling samples.
We've got a question there from the lady. I don't think you can see us.
Yeah, my name's Jo Pye. I'm also from the European Movement. I think Brexit is the elephant in the room, and I would say that is because none of the parties have said we're going to be able to spend X amount of trillions in year one of Brexit, or of Boris's deal, or no Brexit. They have the fact that nobody has based none of the parties have based any of their calculations on the scenario after Brexit, i.e. form of Brexit, means that Brexit is really the elephant in the room, and that people are just voting blind. They cannot be voting along economic lines because the economics are just not there. The true picture isn't being put to us.
Okay, it's a comment rather than a question, but thank you. Let's just pass it on. If you could pass it on to the lady there. Can I just ask a question in the meantime, just whilst we're getting ready there? We've heard that something like 3.2 million new voters, potentially new voters, have registered since this election was called. It's an enormous amount. How much does, and I think the majority of those, I think from what I understand, could be under 34, I think is the, how much does that impact, switching? I mean, you've talked about switching parties. Many of these people don't have a party that they've never voted before.
I think the increase in registration is very interesting, and I believe it's substantially larger than it was at the last election, when it was also quite large. But what we've got to remember is that the switch to individual electoral registration was also accompanied with a move to rolling registration. And what happened is that certain groups became much more likely to drop off the register because of the individual registration, and because registration any time of the year was allowed, means that certain groups, particularly those that move around a lot, were much more likely to drop off the register and then rejoin at election time. So what happened in 2017 was that lots of young people dropped off the register and then they rejoined around election time. So even though they were joining in large numbers, the actual effect was much smaller than it would appear, because they were simply people who had previously dropped off the register.
And you think that could be repeated
and
here?
That could be true again this time. So having said that, the increase is larger, so maybe there is a genuine increase, but we did some research on the impact of individual electoral registration, and it did suggest that particularly young people were the most likely to fall off the register and also the most likely to join before an election.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from, I think, the lady over there.
Yeah. Emma Duncan, I work for The Economist. If this is the Brexit election, it seems to me odd that during the campaign, we don't seem to have talked about Brexit that much, and I'd love to hear some comments on that. And just one other thing, which is if the Conservatives are picking up more Labour leavers than Labour is picking up Tory Remainers, is that the measure of the failure of Labour's electoral strategy?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I guess I said before that there's an interesting mismatch both last time and this time between the party campaigns and what voters seem to care about. And one way we saw that is in the last campaign, and I'm sure this is something we'll repeat when we sort of have the data at the end of the election. If you ask voters what issues they cared about during the campaign, it was basically Brexit, 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 and then after the Manchester terrorist attacks, then they cared about terrorism. But the voters cared about Brexit, even though the parties were doing their best not to talk about it. And so I think this idea that the parties might be doing one thing, but that doesn't mean that voters are necessarily paying attention to that, or that they're making their decisions based on that sort of thing. And as for Labour's electoral campaign, to be honest, I'd rather not comment on sort of partisan things, but I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything.
Yeah, so just one point on Labour's campaign. I think one of the things to bear in mind is electoral change happens throughout the whole period, from the previous election to the next one. So we saw in 2017, it wasn't really a campaign about Brexit, but nonetheless, the electoral change that happened was very much along Brexit lines, because so much had already happened by the time the campaign started. So Labour actually in the campaign drew fairly evenly from Remainers and Leavers, but they'd already lost huge numbers of Leavers prior to the election. So they ended up with quite a polarised electorate without ever actually attracting Remainers specifically. So yeah, when we talk about whether it's a Brexit election or not, we're talking about it for the whole period since the previous election, not just the campaign.
Okay, there's another question. Somebody's got a mic there. Thank you.
Thank you. You talked about the various factors that caused the volatility and the switching. Amongst those were the tribal allegiance, the issues, and so on. But what about the personalities as a factor in perhaps the campaigning more than anything? This campaign seems to be blighted by the lack of, in my perception, of big beasts. In fact, some of them have been completely silent. notably a comment, I think, this morning in the press, Rees-Mogg and Diane Abbott have been absent for probably, well, for reasons anyway.
You might have missed a word out
but couldn't find the adjective. So what I suppose in this, what is the impact of personalities and the big beastism, rather like we see in the US elections more, where it is big beastism of Trump and Obama and the personality cult, rather than the tribal or issue or other issues, other factors?
Question. Yeah, really good question.
I don't have a huge amount of evidence on this, but I would say that this afternoon I'll be talking about Labour voters and untapped potential voters in particular. And I think one thing that's interesting about those people that you might expect to vote Labour because they like the Labour Party, but they're not intending to vote for them, they don't like Jeremy Corbyn anything like as much as those other the people who do actually vote Labour. So that is really indicating that personality of the leaders can actually make a difference. And there's plenty of research to show that leadership does matter at the margins. I mean, I think going back to a previous question, the vote is very much split along Brexit lines, but Labour are by no means mopping up the Remain vote, even though their vote is almost all Remain. So, and obviously one of the important factors by that is the extent to which people like or agree with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, just one other point. I mean, the leadership effect that's probably the largest is actually Nigel Farage, of course. The Brexit Party didn't exist at the start of this year, and he went on to win the European elections within a matter of weeks of starting the party. So certainly there are some figures who are capable of moving a lot of votes very fast. But of course, in a general election, you have a lot of other issues coming in, and he hasn't been able to capitalize on that to quite the same extent as he was in the European elections.
Do you have any evidence at the moment, I know it's very soon actually, just about this idea from the Lib Dems of revoking, which was meant to be, the sort of the big sort of clarion call to those fervent Remainers, but in effect it doesn't seem yet to have materialised. And yet, when it was called at that time, it sort of felt like quite a big moment, and now it seems to have fizzled out.
So I think there's something really interesting about the preferences about what to do next on the referendum. So on the one hand, actually, if you look at Remainers, about half of them have a first preference of revoke. So that's a really big group of voters who, if you gave them the choice of what to do next, would just go with revoke, and that would seem like it would be a huge opportunity for the Lib Dems. But the problem is actually that among those people who support revoke, they're also perfectly fine with a second referendum, whereas the other way around is not necessarily true. So the extreme position is the first preference of a lot of voters, but it's not the second preference of very many. So they're limiting themselves just to that small group, whereas people who support a second referendum tend to have more overlapping preferences.
Yeah, okay, lovely. There's a gentleman there with the microphone.
Can I take up that point about preference in relation to first past the post and its impact on volatility? Because as we saw in 2017, the two major parties won a majority by far since 1951, I think, a percentage of the vote. And yet in the European elections, which based on a different system, their vote collapsed. Could you explain the impact of first past the post and the ability to have preference?
Yes, it's a very good question, and it's something we talk about quite a lot in the book, actually, because the volatility is offset by inertia, essentially. There's a lot of inertia in our party political system. A lot of that is to do with the electoral system. It's not just the electoral system. There's also party identification ties people, systems of funding, the press, and so forth. All have an impact, creating inertia so that the party system remains relatively stable. But I think perhaps the most important factor is the electoral system, because depending on where people live, there isn't a lot of choice in terms of the candidates or the parties that could actually win in those constituencies. And that obviously means that there is a potential for tactical switching in some areas. And that has been a major disadvantage to the smaller parties over the years. But I think maybe John's got some more up-to-date evidence on that.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about in a whole presentation of the tactical voting in 2019, but I think there's a few things going on with the European elections. So on the one hand, you do have a different electoral system, but you also have an election where the EU is always front and center, which tends to mean that parties having messages on the EU get those messages heard a bit more. So the Lib Dems and Brexit Party do better in those elections because it's speaking to their issues. And you also have them being second-order elections, so voters don't necessarily feel that the result matters for governance. They think it's a way to send a message as well. So you have those factors working in as well as just the electoral system.
Okay, question there from the gentleman.
Yeah, sorry, this is a process question. Just checking, the slide you showed us, which was of the last panel survey, with P18. Am I right in saying you said that was conducted November the 1st to the 11th? So that straddles the period in which Farage announced the Brexit Party wouldn't contest Conservative-held seats. So, in a sense, those numbers probably exaggerate the Brexit Party, only for practical reasons, because if there's no Brexit Party candidate, you can't vote for them. So I was just wondering what impact you think sort of stripping that out has. And secondly, just as a matter of curiosity, when you come to presumably the final panel, P19, is that also held over a 10-day period, or do you try and concertina it into a shorter survey period?
As you said, the 17th wave, which was the data I was using, was the 1st to the 11th, I believe. And you're right about straddling the time when Brexit Party kind of retreated. So we do probably have our largest support for the Brexit Party in those data than is now the case. So the 9% Brexit Party were on in our data. So that's obviously going to have fallen away quite a lot since then. The Liberal Democrats were on 16% at that point, and Labour were on 27%, and the Conservatives 38%. So there has been a bit of change since then because of the timing, particularly with the Brexit Party. The wave after that, the campaign wave, was run from the day after that finished, the 12th of November, up until the day.
It's still running now.
It's still running.
So it's done daily. We interview around 1,000 voters per day, and that's following up with the same voters we interviewed before the election as well.
And 30,000 people over the whole.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then they will be re-interviewed for a
died,
third time after the election as well.
And we'll be doing, as you asked about the 19th wave, after the election, starts the day after the election. We normally go for up to 2 weeks, but that would take us to Boxing Day. So we were just talking over breakfast whether people will actually be answering the survey on Christmas Day or not. John suspected they might be. I was surprised, but maybe he's right.
Airplane mode for all phones. Right. Let's get a few more questions. There's a gentleman there, and then there's a couple of gentlemen there, and then somebody, and two down there, and a lady at the back. Good. Okay, let's.
Malcolm Dean, ex-Guardian. Could you tell us a bit more about the disappointing Liberal vote and the degree to which the leader seems to lose more people as more polls are made towards her?
So back down to sort of the personality question, I guess, and about leadership and, how much of an impact that has.
Well, I have to say I haven't looked at the data in terms of what people think about Jo Swinson. I think one issue is probably that part of it is driven by lots of people didn't know who she was, and then lots of people who wouldn't have liked her if they did know who she was because they're Leave voters have suddenly discovered who she is. And so that's going to, push things down a bit more. I guess more generally about the Lib Dems is one thing we look at in the book that Ed touched on before is the role of sort of perceptions of viability in places. And one thing that we didn't really notice sort of in the immediate aftermath of the 2017 election was that amongst Remainers, attitudes towards the Lib Dems had recovered hugely compared to 2015. So just in terms of how people felt about them. You know, people were very negative about the Lib Dems in 2015. And then in 2017, amongst Remainers, the attitudes had sort of shifted, not quite up to what they were sort of, 2010 levels, but like they had got quite far up there. But what didn't change was perceptions of how likely the Lib Dems were to win in seats. Those were basically still at the 2015 levels. And we'll have to look, when we get our data back after the election, how those perceptions have changed this time round. But my feeling is that they're probably going to be quite similar, and that this is the big impediment to a Lib Dem breakthrough, is that people just don't think that they can win, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You don't vote for them because you don't think they're going to win. You talk to other people who aren't voting for them, and so the cycle continues.
And of course, when they did have power, they let lots of people down. So there's that element as well. Okay, let's grab a couple of the question there, and then from the gentleman at the back as well.
How soon? You said you're going to poll people after they've actually voted. How soon will that data be? When will that data be published? A question about the volatility in European elections. If European elections are second-order elections, in other words, no one really cares who their MEP is, it's a protest vote, has anyone ever stripped those elections out, and how does that sort of make volatility look much bigger than it really is? And the other question, which I don't know if there's an answer to, but at the beginning you said the kind of the three big explanations of switching or volatility were decline in in the rise of the small parties, electoral shocks, and then the third thing I can't remember. Which has anyone ever asked what lies behind those things? So if that's kind of why is volatility increasing, why are those things increasing? What is that linked to the fact that there used to be 3-4 million members of the Tory party in the 50s and to have many million Labour Party members in the 50s, and has anyone got an explanation of those bigger trends?
So I'll deal with the sort of first easy question. We haven't got a strict schedule. We are generally a bit slower than say pollsters because we release our individual level data files and not just sort of summary tables. In 2017, it took us 5 weeks from when the fieldwork ended to when we released our data. We have Christmas this time, so it might be a little bit slower, but I guess probably February, sometime around that. Yeah, and then on the volatility and second-order elections, we're not actually, those weren't in that graph, actually. Those were just general elections. We do think, though, that there is probably some role for these second-order elections in driving volatility, right? Because if you have a chance to vote for a different party to what you might normally vote for, there's a lot of good evidence in political science that suggests that this helps break down some of the sort of bonds you might have with your usual party because you've betrayed them in some sense, and then it's much easier to switch around to another party later on, and then.
Yeah, so the question of what lies behind the trends driving volatility, it's a great question, and the answer is we don't 100% know. But what we do see is that party identity has declined mostly generationally. So each generation comes in with lower levels of party identity than the previous one. And so there's kind of a ratchet effect here. Part of it is each generation socializes the next one. So there's fewer and fewer young people being socialized by politically identifying parents. So that's definitely part of it too. But there's probably some deep social trends going on in here, and we've looked as much as we can, but beyond the generational replacement, it's still, I would say, an outstanding mystery in the electorate.
Okay, lovely question there. I think we've probably got time for about 3 more questions.
Yes, quick question.
Not all yours, though.
No, don't worry. I only have one quick question. I'm also from The Economist. I like this phrase that Brexit is now the basis of all British politics, but it raises in my mind perhaps a speculative question because you don't have data on this. What happens to coin a phrase when Brexit gets done? Does this continue or does it completely disappear?
It's sort of hard to know. So one of the things we talk about in the book is the sort of potential for electoral shocks to basically upset the apple cart. And you only have to go back to 2015, which was within a normal electoral cycle. And back then we were talking about austerity, we were talking about the impact of cuts, and that was basically what the 2015 election was largely about. And now no one cares about austerity. You know, well, I mean, Labour keep talking about it, but by and large, you know, the people who were pro-austerity don't seem to be that bothered by it anymore. You know, there's no talk about cuts, and voters aren't sort of punishing the parties anymore for what they did to the economy. And so one way Brexit could play out is that something else comes along, and you know, we start caring about that. A sort of second way it could come about is that, you know, if Brexit goes badly and the economy struggles, then we could sort of see a slightly oddly Brexit-caused return to the sort of economic competition as you know, people start to care about these things again, or you know, other issues that sort of tap into this cultural divide in British public opinion could, you know, take up the Brexit mantle, as you like, and we could continue along this sort of road of sort of social issue politics, a bit like the US has done. And so we don't know is the sort of, you know, simple answer, but you know, it could play out in a sort of variety of ways.
Another question there.
Yeah, it's just a question about the volatility of 2017 compared to now. One of the things that I found talking to people in the 2017 election was that a lot of Conservative Remainers especially were happy to switch because they thought the outcome of the election was predetermined, that the Conservatives were heading for a big majority, and that was the narrative all the way through the campaign. And they were happy to switch on that basis because they didn't think they would accidentally put Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. Anecdotally, that seems to be slightly different this time, and the narrative is that it's a lot closer election. Do you measure the extent to which people think that their vote matters in the election and the impact that that has on their willingness to switch? And do you think that's... And have you picked up that change with Conservative Remainers this time?
So John and I actually looked at this question of, you know, whether people were voting for Jeremy Corbyn because they thought he was going to lose. And actually we found the opposite, that the more people, you know, thought he was going to win in 2017, the more likely they were actually to flock for him. And I think partly this is because, you know, back in 2017, a lot of the reasons people disliked Jeremy Corbyn was because they thought other people disliked him, and so they thought he was going to lose the election. And then once it, you know, became apparent that actually, you know, there was a bit more momentum behind him, they lost that, you know, that big reason to dislike him. And so, you know, I'm sure there were some Conservatives who thought that, you know, they had a safe chance, and so they did. So, you know, there's definitely going to be a few people like that, but the sort of dominant story we think is the opposite. And then in terms of a general pattern, some work I've done with Jane and Ed shows that when people think there's going to be a hung parliament, they're much more likely to support the smaller parties, because the smaller parties are more likely to have a sort of a larger sort of power in a hung parliament situation. And so these perceptions do matter, and we do measure them throughout the campaign. I don't know actually what they're saying at the moment, to be honest. I haven't looked at it.
Just on that, voters at the moment have a surprisingly strong expectation that there will be a hung parliament. I think most pollsters and experts think that a Tory majority is very likely, but voters think there's a much higher probability that there could be a hung parliament, nearly as likely as a Conservative majority. That doesn't mean they're right, but a lot of them are making that... a lot of them have that in their mind when they're making their decisions at the moment.
And interestingly, you know, when there was the seat-by-seat projection that came out probably last week, I think it was a Tory majority of 68, I think it said in the end. I mean, do you have any sense of what impact that actually has on undecided voters, in the sense that actually, since then, in some polls, it looks like Labour have increased their percentage vote by two or 3 points? You know, the lead has narrowed to 9. Can you sense whether actually those sorts of projections of a Tory majority galvanise more undecided Labour voters to go, we better get out there?
So our data came in just before the MRP was released, so we don't have the reactions to that yet. But what I can say is only about 11% of voters in the campaign so far, when we got our data, had visited a tactical voting website. So that's maybe high, maybe low, depending on what you think, but it's certainly not a very high proportion of voters who are paying attention to these sources. Maybe they'll switch to it towards the end of the campaign when they're making their final decision, but at the moment, that information may or may not be actually filtering through to every voter. So I think it probably has more effect on maybe the media narrative that more voters end up seeing than it does directly on them by reading the seat-by-seat results.
Okay, interesting. Go on. Edward.
We have asked an interesting question actually, which about where people got their information from about which party was winning. Well, we asked respondents to assess how likely each party is to win in their constituency, and then we asked them what information they used to come to that conclusion. Obviously, we haven't looked in great detail yet, but I think the most common source of information is simply the election result in the previous election. So I don't think they're necessarily updating very reliably.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Have you got a mic? Yeah.
Niall Walsh, Oxford Analytica. My question is, to what extent do you see the potential for blue-collar voters in influencing this election outcome?
Sure. So I think certainly blue-collar voters, working-class voters, are distributed in a fairly concentrated way in some quite important seats that the Conservatives might want to take. So their choices, I think, are going to be important. But that's true of a lot of different groups of voters. So I think we should absolutely be paying attention to what working-class voters are going to do, but they're far from the only group who might swing the election.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question if we have one. And that's ended very nicely. No more questions. There is one question. There you go. Sorry, you're right under my nose. Should I give you that here?
Thank you very much. To what extent are other issues like, for example, the health service or climate change, frankly, being crowded out by Brexit?
So just on the climate change one, I think one of the really interesting shifts in the polls was the support for the Green Party, which before the election was called was on the up and up and up. You know, the environment had been in the news, Extinction Rebellion was going on. And that was going up particularly amongst young people, as you sort of might expect. But then the election was called, and then very, very quickly it dived back around the other way. And I think it is being crowded out. And I guess the NHS is a sort of perennial election issue. We'll sort of know after the fact more how that has sort of played out. There's been a lot of speculation that, you know, because it's winter and because, you know, the NHS is, you know, generally more under strain during winter, that we might have more of an NHS effect. But I don't know if that will be the case. Anyone else?
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Can we just show our appreciation to Professor Edward Fieldhouse, Dr. Jonathan Mellon, and Dr. Christopher Prosser. Thank you very much.